What would you do if you woke up in someone else's body, in a world that had already decided you weren't worth feeding? Not a warrior, not a mudge, not a chosen one. Just a warehouse worker from Seoul with callous hands and a label on his chest that read, "Weak, do not feed." Daniel Cho had worked a 12-hour shift loading trucks at a warehouse outside Seoul. He fell asleep at the wheel on the drive home. There was a crash, then silence, then sand filling his mouth and a foreign sun burning through his eyelids. He opened his eyes to a body that wasn't his, ribs pressing through skin like tent poles, thin hands without a single callus, legs that trembled at the thought of standing, and on his chest, a tag, tied there like a label on a return shipment. "Weak, do not feed." He tugged at the ropes binding his wrists. They held. He looked at someone else's hands and understood what had happened before he had words for it. He was somewhere else, in someone else's bones, left to die in the middle of a salt flat with no water and no explanation. Panic rose in his stomach like a hot wave. He pushed it down. He had done this before. Not this exactly, but the principle was the same. At the warehouse, the system had frozen mid-loading once while 20 tons of chicken thawed in the truck bed. The new workers ran in circles calling for the manager. Daniel opened the spare chamber and started hauling boxes. Panic doesn't solve the problem. Hands do. He exhaled. He counted. Water. 6 hours without it in this heat. Shade. There were rocks on the horizon, roughly 2 kilometers away. Who he was and how he got here, that could wait. The dead don't ask questions. He rocked the stake his rope was tied to with his foot until the loose ground gave it up. He stood on someone else's weak legs and staggered toward the rocks. He found a sharp edge of stone and began sawing the rope against it, grinding his wrists raw in the process. He tore a strip from the hem of his pants and wrapped his hands. The sun pressed down on his head like a vice. The scorched rock burned his bare feet. His body wobbled with every step. This man hadn't had a proper meal in a long time, and the world had decided that was his fault. Daniel gritted his teeth and kept walking. He reached the cliffs as the sun began to set in the west. A reddish rock face 15 meters high with a crevice between 2 boulders. Inside the crevice, shadow, almost cold after the hell outside. He leaned his back against the stone and breathed. Alive, tied up without water or food, labeled defective merchandise in a foreign body in a foreign world. But alive, he remembered days at the warehouse when only 1.5 truckloads would arrive instead of 5. You don't lose your mind. You count what's left. You work with what you have. He crawled deeper into the crevice and ran his fingers along the smooth wall. A horizontal line, distinct, at knee level, a channel where water had once flowed. He followed it deeper into the darkness. His fingers touched something cold and smooth that was not stone. Metal, flat, vertical, with a handle. A door, a metal door set into the rock in the middle of the desert. Above it, raised symbols he read with his fingertips like a blind man. Hangul, Korean letters. Here, his heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his throat. He traced the words symbol by symbol. Warehouse Terminal Number 7 East. Emergency Reserve Sector. He had worked next to a room like this at his old job, a basement stockroom. Untouchable reserves for disaster scenarios. Water, rations, a first aid kit. Things that save lives when everything else has collapsed. And here was a door in the rock on the other side of reality, with an inscription in his native language. He squeezed the handle and pushed with everything his thin body had. Something creaked. It clicked. A chill pulled him forward into the crack, not a breeze, but cold air. The cold of a running refrigerator. 1 step, 2 steps, and bluish emergency lighting flickered on near the ceiling. Gray concrete walls, a metal grate floor, cables running beneath it. Signs in Korean every 3 meters. Storage sector, power unit, control. The corridor led him into a circular hall with a terminal at the center, a screen, a keyboard, a serving window like the ones in automated cafeterias. He approached and the screen lit up. Green letters on black, system initialized, emergency mode, energy reserve 14%, solar panels damaged, available categories, food, beverages, medications. A cursor blinked at the bottom, waiting. And something strange happened to Daniel in that moment. He felt no fear, no confusion, only the same calm professional readiness he felt every morning when he opened the warehouse program at the start of his shift. It was a warehouse, an impossible one, crammed into a rock at the edge of the universe, but a warehouse, and he was a stock clerk. and he knew exactly what to do. His fingers rested on the keyboard. Drinking water, 500 milliliters, 1 unit. The terminal hummed. Something buzzed inside the wall. A tray slid out of the window. On it, a plastic bottle with a label in Korean. A brand he recognized from the store near his house back home. Cold, real. He unscrewed the cap and took the first sip. The best sip of his life in either of his lives. He didn't gulp it down. After dehydration, his stomach couldn't handle it. A quarter of the bottle. A pause. Another quarter. Control. Discipline. For the next 2 hours he flipped through the catalog, and his eyes widened with every page. Rice, flour, sugar, canned goods, meat, fish, antibiotics, vitamins, hundreds of pages. This wasn't an emergency kit. This was an entire food supply base. Enough for years of self-sufficiency. But the energy was the problem. At 17%, the terminal could produce 35 servings a day. More than enough for one person, nowhere near enough for 100. He found the maintenance section, 8 solar panels on the rock, 6 buried in sand, 1 cracked, 1 working. Clean 5 of them and power would rise to 70%, 120 portions a day, a number he could actually work with. He fell asleep right there on the cold metal grate, the way people sleep when they know tomorrow will be hard. In the morning the terminal's beep woke him. Charging had begun. He ate a portion of rice cross-legged on the floor and caught himself doing the math. 35 servings. He needed 3. What to do with the remaining 32? He didn't know where he was yet. He didn't know the language, but he was already counting the leftovers and thinking about distribution. He smirked. Fine. This was what he knew how to do. This was what kept him going. He spent the morning digging sand off the buried solar panels with his bare hands. No gloves, no shovel, just the burning sand and raw palms and the understanding that every panel he cleared meant another portion per day for someone not yet born into this problem. By noon he had cleared 4. His hands were scraped red and trembling. He climbed down and checked the terminal. 52%, 91 portions per day. He looked at his ruined hands and thought 91 was an insane amount for one person. He already knew he wouldn't be alone for long. She appeared on the 3rd day. Daniel was sitting at the entrance to the crevice, whittling a stick against stone, not out of boredom, but because his palms were covered in blisters and he needed a tool to scrape the remaining sand off the last panels without tearing his hands further. He heard the sound before he saw the source, a rustle, then ragged breathing, then the crunch of uneven footsteps. A figure emerged from around the bend, small and thin, took the steps, and fell face first into the sand. Daniel crossed to her in seconds and turned her onto her back. A girl, 11, maybe 12, hair matted and dirty, face gray, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes half open and unseeing. He pressed his palm to her forehead. Hot, fever, severe dehydration. He pinched the skin on the back of her hand and watched it stay creased. Her body had lost an enormous amount of fluid. He hoisted her and carried her toward the terminal entrance, surprised by how little she weighed. Like an empty box, bones and skin. He didn't order plain water. That was the first and most important decision, because he remembered from a first aid course at the warehouse 2 years back. Plain water after severe dehydration can kill. The stomach rejects it. Vomiting begins. The body loses even more fluid, and the spiral only tightens. He tapped on the keyboard, oral rehydration solution, powder, single dose. The terminal dispensed a small packet, and he read the ingredients: sodium chloride, potassium chloride, glucose, tritium citrate, all in the right proportions. He ordered warm water, not cold, because cold would cause stomach cramps, and mixed the powder into the bottle cap. Then, at the last moment, he added one more thing: honey, 5 grams. A single drop stirred in so it wouldn't taste so terrible, so the girl wouldn't spit it out. A small thing, but small things matter. He lifted her head and brought the cap to her lips, tilted it just barely. A few drops fell into her mouth. She swallowed without opening her eyes. Good. He waited the minutes. A few more drops, 2 more minutes, more drops. Slow and patient, like an IV, except instead of a needle and tube, he had only his hands and a bottle cap. By evening she could sit up. He gave her a cracker, one, small, and she looked at him as though he'd handed her gold. She took a bite and chewed with her eyes closed, not from weakness, but from the taste. A plain dry cracker, the simplest food in the world. To her, it was something beyond comprehension. She finished it, looked at him, pointed at herself, and said a word. Mira. He pointed at himself. Dan. She tried it. The sound was softer in her pronunciation, but recognizable. Then she pointed at the cracker and raised her eyebrows. He didn't try to explain. He simply took out a second cracker and held it toward her. She took it, broke it in half, and held one half back out to him. Daniel froze. She had been dying of thirst and hunger for 3 days and had just received the second cracker of her life, and she was splitting it in half. He took the half. They ate together in silence in the blue light of the emergency LEDs, on the cold metal floor of a warehouse from another world. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Mira was asleep against the wall, covered with the remains of his shirt. And he sat at the terminal and thought. She had come from somewhere. That meant people were nearby, other outcasts, a camp, a group of survivors. She had been heading toward the cliffs, which meant she knew shade or water might be here. Or she was simply wandering and got lucky. Either way, she wasn't the first. If this world was dumping people in the desert with tags and no food, there would be many more like her. He stared at the terminal screen. 91 rations. He used 3. That left 88. One person needs about 2 rations a day counting both food and water. He could feed another 40 people. If he cleared the remaining panels, even more. The thought was simple and terrifying at the same time. On the 4th morning, Mira woke on her own, sat up, looked around, and for the first time gave him a smile. Just the corner of her mouth, barely there. But it was a smile. He showed her how the terminal worked, typed the text, pressed the button. Food comes out through the little window. She recoiled when the tray slid out, then crept closer and touched the glass with one finger. She said something long and fast that, from the intonation, meant something like, "You are a sorcerer." He shook his head and pointed at the keyboard, pointed at his hands, shook his head again. Not magic, a machine. She didn't understand, but she accepted it. Children accept the incomprehensible more easily than adults do. They climbed the rock together that morning to clear the last 2 panels. Mira's small fingers clinging to the ledges with a stubbornness that surprised him. By noon, the 5th panel was clear. He checked the terminal, 61%, 107 servings per day. He nodded. Every panel counted. Every percentage point meant another hot meal for someone who didn't have one yet. On the 5th day, a young man appeared from the west walking straight toward the cliffs. Not staggering, not dragging his feet, but moving with the kind of determination that said he knew exactly where he was going. Mira saw him first and sprinted toward him screaming. He saw her and his face broke open and he ran. They collided halfway and he lifted her off the ground and held her while they both cried. A brother. Daniel understood that without a translation, just from the way the man held her. He had crossed the desert alone to find his sister. His name was Turan, and he didn't leave. The next morning he brought for more. 2 men, a woman with a child in her arms, all from the same group of exiles. All in the same condition, gray faces, cracked lips, ribs visible through their clothes. The child was about 2 years old and wasn't crying. Children who have been starving for a long time stop crying. They don't have the strength for it. Daniel sat them down in the shade of the crevice and went to the terminal. He ordered 6 servings of rehydration solution, 6 bottles of water, 6 bowls of rice porridge, honey, salt. For the child he ordered separately, baby food, soft, easy to digest, no salt, no spices. A smiling baby was drawn on the package, a Korean brand he recognized. This was what they fed children all over Korea. Now it would feed a child in the desert on the other side of reality. The woman took the jar. She looked at the picture, then at Daniel. Her eyes were wet. She opened the lid and began feeding the child with a small spoon. The child ate, and a minute later, for the first time in a long time, he cried, not from hunger, from the fact that there was food. Daniel turned away. He looked at the screen. 107 servings minus 12 for today, 95 left. Enough for now. By the end of the first week there were 9 of them. Daniel, Mira, Turan, for from the camp. An old man with a cane who arrived one morning leaning on a twisted staff, and a young woman with a scarred face who said nothing about how she got the scars. All outcasts, all with the same story. The village decided they were weak, useless, a burden, and sent them into the wastelands to die. Some with a sign on their chest, some without. The result was the same. Daniel fed them all, every day, 3 times a day. Morning, rice porridge with salt and dried meat. Noon, crackers and water. Evening, oatmeal dissolved in boiling water with dried vegetables, noodles, soy sauce. A hot soup that smelled like nothing any of them had ever encountered. On the seventh evening, when he set 9 bowls of hot soup before 9 people, the old man with the cane looked into his bowl and let the steam rise to his face. He brought the bowl to his lips, took a sip, set it down, and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying silently. The woman with the scarred face placed a hand on his shoulder. She was crying, too. Taran sat like a stone, jaw clenched, eyes wet. Mira ate in small sips and watched Daniel without looking away. Daniel sat across from them and ate the same soup from the same bowl. He didn't make speeches. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't explain. He just ate beside them because that was the only thing that made sense. On the 9th day, he realized the problem wasn't the food. People ate, drank, slept in the shade of the rocks, woke, ate again, and so on. Surviving, but not living. He could see it in their eyes, dull and empty, like the people in line for free meals at a subway station in Seoul. Grateful, but lifeless. They had grown accustomed to being the ones who are fed, who wait, who take. Each of them carried an invisible version of the sign from Daniel's chest. He decided it was time to change that. Not with words. He was not good at speeches. He was good at giving orders. On the morning of the 10th day, he didn't hand out breakfast. Instead, he went out with a pointed stick and drew a rectangle in the sand, 5 meters by 3. He pointed at Taran, pointed at the stick, pointed at the rectangle, and made a digging gesture. Taran frowned. He looked at the rectangle, then at Daniel, then at the bowl of hot porridge Daniel pulled from behind his back and set beside the outline. First, you dig, then you eat. Taran's face flushed. For a second, Daniel saw anger. You're making me work for my food. Just like in the village, just like everywhere. Daniel didn't back down. He picked up a second stick and started digging beside the rectangle. Himself, alone, in silence. A minute later, Taran stood next to him and started digging too. That evening Daniel cooked for real. Not oatmeal and cube soup, but rice porridge with meat and vegetables. Using dried ingredients from the catalog, a tin can as a pot, the fire Taran had coaxed from flint and dry shrub roots. The aroma drifted through the crevice, and all 9 people turned their heads in unison toward the fire, like sunflowers turning toward the sun. Soy sauce, sesame oil, things that didn't exist in this world. For Daniel, ordinary comfort food from after night shifts. For them, a scent from another planet. He divided the porridge into bowls, tin cans repurposed as dishes, and handed them out. No one ate. They waited. He understood after a moment. They were waiting for him to start first. He picked up his bowl, took a sip, nodded. They began. Taran stopped at the 3rd spoonful. He looked into the bowl, then at Daniel, and nodded once, briefly. Not a bow of gratitude, something else. Acknowledgement. You're not just feeding me. You're feeding me in a way that makes me want to keep living. Word spread across the wastelands in ways Daniel couldn't track. He sent no messengers, posted no signs, and yet on the 12th day 3 more arrived. On the 14th, 5 more. All emaciated, dehydrated, with empty eyes. Outcasts who had heard a rumor and followed it to the cliffs. They saw people eating hot food who didn't look like they were dying, and they stayed. By the end of the 2nd week there were 17 of them, not counting Daniel. There were enough portions, but Daniel was already counting ahead. 17 people, 3rd of 4 portions daily plus his 3. 3rd of 7 out of 107. That left 70, which sounded like a lot, but if 5 or 6 new ones arrived each week, in a month there would be 40, in 2 months 60. In 3 the resources would be stretched to their limit. He climbed the cliff with Taran and showed him the 6th panel, the last one buried in sand. Farther out, right at the edge of a ledge with a rocky overhang acting like a funnel, channeling the wind so it poured sand directly onto the surface. Even if they cleared it, it would be buried again within a week. He sat on the edge and thought. Flat stones lay nearby, thin ones. If he set them vertically in front of the panel like a wall, a semicircle acting as a shield, the wind would hit the barrier and drop the sand short of the panel. Not perfect, but it would stop most of it. He showed Taran. Taran looked, thought, nodded. They hauled stones and built the low semicircular shield, then cleared the panel beneath. Back at the terminal, 68%, 119 portions per day. He nodded. Good. Every panel broken. 6 out of 7 working. and 119 was the ceiling, the number he would have to build an entire world around. On the 17th day, he established the first rule. He couldn't explain it in words yet. Mira was teaching him the language 5 to 10 words a day, and a logistics specialist has a good memory for systems, so he was learning fast. But this rule he explained with action. He laid out on the ground in front of everyone all the food from the storage pit: rice, dried meat, crackers, salt, water. He gestured to all 17 people, then to the food, then raised 3 fingers, 3 times a day. Then he pointed to himself, to Turan, to one of the men, 3 distributors. Same portion for everyone, including himself, not 1 grain more. Turan translated. He saw the exchanged glances. In this world, the one who feeds always eats first and the most. That is the law. And this man was putting himself on exactly the same level as everyone else. The old man with the cane looked at Daniel for a long moment and said one word. Mira translated it later. It meant something like fair, or right, or real. One word in this language that held all 3 meanings at once. On the 20th day, the first quarrel happened. One of the new arrivals, a large man with heavy hands who looked like a former farmhand, approached the storage pit at night and took an extra portion. Turan caught him. The man shoved Turan to the ground. Turan got back up with his fists clenched. Daniel woke from the noise and walked out to find 2 men facing each other in the moonlight. Crackers scattered in the sand between them. He stood between them and gestured for the man to sit. The man's eyes were angry in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, not physically. He ate 3 times a day like everyone else, but the hunger inside him lived somewhere older and deeper. He had always been last, and his body remembered. Tomorrow they might not give it to him. Tomorrow they might kick him out. Take it now while you can. Daniel had seen this before, at the warehouse after a typhoon when humanitarian aid arrived and people grabbed 3 bags of rice even though 1 would have been enough. Not greed. Fear. Pure animal fear of starvation. Daniel didn't scold him. He didn't punish him. He went to the terminal and returned a minute later with a bowl, hot rice porridge, fresh from the dispenser. He set it in front of the man, sat down beside him, and gestured, "Eat." The man's fist unclenched. He sat down. He took the bowl. He ate in silence. When he finished, Daniel pointed to the storage pit, then to the sky, then back to the pit. There will be food, every day. The man's throat moved as though he were swallowing something other than porridge. He nodded. He went to sleep. He didn't steal again. But every single morning after that, he was the first to come to the storage pit. He stood nearby, made sure the food was there, and only then walked away. That night, Daniel introduced the second rule. He had Mira help him explain it. She understood his gestures almost without fail now, as she translated as he spoke in broken Altera with a Korean accent. The rule was simple. No one here pays for food, but everyone does what they can. Those who can carry stones, carry stones. Those who can sew, mend clothes. Those who can count, tally the supplies. Those who can't do anything yet, they learn. You don't pay with your portion, you pay with what you are. The old man with the cane nodded. He understood. This was not slavery, and it was not a transaction. It was an order, a system in which everyone had a place, and every place mattered. Daniel didn't know it yet, but in a world where a person's value was measured by the power of their magical gift, he was building the only place that measured value by what you were willing to give to others. Without magic, without labels, without exceptions. By the end of the first month, there were 32 of them. Every night before sleep, Daniel went to the terminal and entered the data into a text file. Number of people, daily consumption, remaining power, panel status, problems, plans. He tracked it like a warehouse because that's what it was. Only instead of goods on shelves, there were people behind the walls. And instead of expiration dates, he calculated how many days a specific person could survive without a hot meal if the system suddenly failed. Mira became his right-hand assistant, not because he appointed her, but because she stood by his side and didn't leave. She had a frighteningly precise memory. She remembered the name of every new person, when they arrived, in what condition, what they ate on their first day. He told her once in broken Altera, "You remember better than my terminal." She looked at him seriously and replied, "The terminal remembers numbers. I remember faces." On the 35th day, the first caravan arrived. Not outcasts, merchants, real ones. 3 wagons and 8 people who had veered off their route to avoid the tax posts and stumbled onto smoke rising from the hearths below the cliffs. Daniel had advance warning. Turan had organized a lookout rotation of 4 men taking turns at the top of the cliff. When the wagons appeared on the horizon, Daniel went out to meet them alone, unarmed. The merchant leader was a middle-aged man with shrewd eyes and a scar on his chin who looked at Daniel, at the camp behind him, at the people who had stopped working to stare, and said something that Daniel, who by now understood simple phrases, translated as, "Who are you? What is this? How many of you are there?" He answered, slowly, with mistakes, but clearly, "We live here. We have food. We are not thieves." The merchant looked skeptical. There were no camps with food in the wastelands, only the dead. But he came closer alone, and Daniel led him through the shelters, the fire pits, the storage pit. He proposed a deal, food for tools. He handed the merchant a piece of bread, soft, airy, with a faint sweetness. Nothing like the gray barley flatbread that existed in this world. The merchant took a bite. He froze. He chewed slowly. His eyes widened. He had never tasted anything like it. He swallowed, looked at Daniel with completely different eyes, and said one word, "How much?" Daniel raised his hand and asked, "What do you have?" He inspected the carts the way he would inspect an incoming shipment, methodically, picking things up and feeling them, assessing them. The merchant watched the smirk fade from his own face as he realized this skinny man in ragged shirt sleeves knew his way around goods. Daniel made his selection, 20 meters of heavy fabric, rope, to hammers, nails, clay bowls, 3 knives. For this he gave 5 loaves, crackers, dried meat, and 2 bottles of honey. The merchant opened one honey jar and tasted it right there in front of Daniel. He froze with his eyes closed. Honey was a rarity in Altera, but this honey was thick, dark, with a floral aroma that simply did not exist anywhere in this world. He closed the jar carefully, like a man handling treasure, and promised to return in 2 weeks with whatever Daniel asked for. Daniel nodded. He already had a list in his head: shovels, pickaxes, buckets, seeds, clay for bricks. He was going to build walls. After the caravan left, Daniel gathered everyone. He spoke slowly in broken Altera, and they listened. He said, "We will not just survive. We will build. We need walls, water, land where something grows. I can give you food, but I cannot give you a home. We will build a home together." Some nodded. Some looked skeptical. 30 to people in the desert without magic, without tools, without protection against a whole world that had decided they were trash. The old man with the cane stood up, leaning heavily on his staff. He scanned everyone, then looked at Daniel and spoke a long sentence. Turan translated. In his village there was a saying, "A wall begins with a single stone." He was old and weak, but he could still lift one. He bent down. He picked up a stone the size of a fist. He placed it in front of Daniel. Turan bent down and added a second. Mira added a third. The woman with the scarred face added a fourth. By evening there was a pile of 32 stones in front of Daniel, one from each of them. He looked at the pile, and for the first time since arriving in this world, his throat tightened. He swallowed. He nodded, and he said the one word he had already learned in the language of Altera. Good. Construction began the next day. Daniel wasn't an architect and wasn't a builder, but he knew one thing: a warehouse needs walls. Walls protect from weather, from thieves, from wind, from sand, and walls make a place a place. Not just a dot in the desert, but somewhere you can come to and somewhere you don't want to leave. He sketched a plan in the sand, a simple rectangle, 20 meters by 15, built around the crevice leading to the terminal. Stone walls 1.5 meters high, not for defense, for marking. "This is our place." Turan organized the men to gather stone. The women mixed clay from sand and water as mortar. The children brought small stones to fill in the cracks. Everyone worked without exception, including Daniel, whose hands had by now grown rougher than on the first day, with calluses and cracks that he stopped bothering to wrap. By the end of the first month, one corner was ready, a quarter of one wall, crooked and uneven with bits of clay sticking out from between the stones. But it was a wall. Daniel stood atop the cliff and looked down at the camp, 2 shelters, 2 fire pits, a storage pit, a section of wall, 30 to people who a month ago had been labeled trash. Now they ate 3 times a day, built, argued about where to put the next stone. It wasn't a city, not even a village. It was a seedling in dead soil. but it was alive and it was growing. He climbed down, went to the terminal, and ordered himself 1 cup of coffee, black, no sugar. A small indulgence he allowed himself once every 3 days. The smell filled the room, a smell from a past life, from night shifts, from a world where he was a nobody, an invisible logistics worker who made sure food got to the shelves. He took a sip, closed his eyes. Same taste, same bitterness. Different man. She appeared on the 50th day. The same morning Daniel noticed the tomatoes had sprouted, tiny green dots in the brown earth, seeds from his world growing in the soil of another. He was kneeling over the garden bed looking at the sprouts when Haran approached and said, "Someone's coming from the west." One person, walking confidently. Daniel went to the western wall and watched. Outcasts stagger. They dragged their feet. This figure moved like a person who knows where she is going and why. She stopped 10 paces from the wall. Tall, light hair pinned back, straight spine, clean clothes, not rags, a cloak, boots, a bag on her belt. She looked at the camp, at the walls, at the smoke, at the people who had stopped to stare back, and she spoke clearly, without pleading in her voice. "My name is Ariel Hale, former priestess of the Temple of the Gift of the Earth. I left the order. I have nowhere to go. I heard that here they feed those who have nowhere else to go. Is that true?" Daniel looked at her, a priestess from the very institution that controlled the magic of agriculture in this world, that decided who ate and who didn't, that hung up signs reading weak, "Do not feed." She had come from there, and she stood before his wall with her back straight and her eyes clear, asking, not begging. "There's a difference." He answered in his broken Altera, "It's true, they feed people here." She stepped over the low wall, entered, and looked around. Half the camp stepped back when they recognized the style of her clothing, priestly, even without the order's insignia. Something about her bearing carried the temple in it, and for people the temple had cast into the desert, that was enough to make them shrink. Ariel noticed it. Daniel saw her jaw clench for 1 second before it relaxed. She turned to him and said, "I didn't come as a priestess. I came as a human. If you need proof, tell me how." Daniel looked at her, looked at Mira standing nearby with a tense expression, looked at Turan with his hand resting on the knife at his belt, and he said, "Have you eaten today?" She blinked. It wasn't the question she had expected. "No," she said, "not in 2 days." Daniel nodded, walked to the hearth, and returned with a bowl, rice with meat and vegetables, hot. He set it on the stone in front of her and sat across from her. She stood, looked at the bowl, then at him, then sat down and ate in silence, quickly. She was hungrier than she had let on. When the bowl was empty, she looked up. Daniel said, "There's one rule here. Everyone eats the same. Everyone works. You pay with what you know how to do." "What do you know how to do?" Ariel set down the empty bowl and looked him in the eyes, straight on, without flinching. She answered, "I can read, write, count. I know the laws of the kingdom. I know the map of Altera. I know the names of all the lords and their lands. I know how the temple is built. I know its weaknesses. And I know that in 6 months, everything you are building here will be useless. Because in 6 months, the drought will reach the capital. And then it won't be merchants who come here. It will be an army." Daniel was silent. He had heard the word drought from the merchants. No rain, rivers drying up. But he hadn't known the scale. He hadn't known it was a catastrophe creeping east to west and devouring everything in its path. Ariel knew, because in the temple they spoke of it behind closed doors. The earth mages sensed it. The gift was working less and less effectively. What used to yield a harvest in a day now took a week. The temple was silent. The royal court was silent. Because if people found out that magic was failing, the entire system, the entire hierarchy, the entire world would collapse. She spoke for 20 minutes, facts, dates, provinces that had lost their harvests, rivers that had become mud and then salt, and Daniel listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. He looked at his small camp, 30 to people, a section of wall, to fire pits, a garden bed with tomatoes that had just sprouted, and a drought that in 6 months would devour this world entire. Then he asked her, "Why did you come?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Because for 10 years I served a God who feeds only the strong, and you feed the weak. And I became curious which of you is right." Daniel stood up, walked to the terminal, and ordered 1 slice of bread, 10 grams of butter, 2 grams of salt. He returned and placed it in front of her. She looked at the bread and something stirred in her face. 1 second only. Then it returned to calm. Bread with butter and salt, the way they made it in her village before the temple. Before everything. She took a bite, chewed, swallowed. Her eyes grew wet. She didn't cry, but the tears were there. She finished the bread, wiped her hands, and said one word, "I'll stay." That night Daniel sat at the terminal and opened a text file. He wrote in Korean because he could think faster in Korean. 6 months. What could he do in 6 months? Point 1. Increase the terminal's power. Inspect the cracked 7th panel. See if anything could be salvaged. Point 2. Finish the wall perimeter by end of month 2. Point 3. Find a water source independent of the terminal. Condensation systems. Morning dew collection, anything. Point 4. Expand the gardens. Try grain if tomatoes can grow here. Point 5. People. 30 wasn't enough against what was coming. The camp needed not only outcasts, but those with something to offer. Craftsmen, merchants, perhaps even soldiers. Point 6. Information. Ariel knew the politics, the map, the players, use that. Point 7. The mystery. Who sent the terminal? Why, and why him specifically? Not urgent, but the question wouldn't go away. He wrote until dawn. 3 screens of dense text, then saved the file and walked outside. The sun was rising, orange and enormous, turning the dessert pink. Mira was already at the hearth making rice porridge. She looked at him and said, "You didn't sleep again." He sat down beside her without answering. She set a bowl in front of him, rice, meat, vegetables, his portion, always the same, always ready. He ate and watched the sunrise and thought about how in 6 months the same sun would shine on dead earth if he remained just a storekeeper. Then Mira said quietly, "That woman, the priestess, she told you something bad." "Yes," he said. "Bad." Mira was silent. Then she said, "But you didn't leave." "No." He replied, "I didn't leave." She nodded as though that was all she needed to know. They finished breakfast. He stood up, walked to the wall, and picked up a stone. The day began. Ariel turned out to be more useful than Daniel could have imagined. He sat her down next to the terminal on the 3rd day after her arrival and asked her to tell him everything she knew about the map of Altera. She spoke for 4 hours while he drew with a stick in the trampled earth. The continent stretched west to east, fertile plains in the west with the capital, the temples, the great cities, and the further east you went, the drier it became. Steppes giving way to foothills, foothills to wastelands, the wastelands to the very edge. From the salt spring to the nearest large city, a trading hub called Carvin, was 3 days by cart. Beyond that sat Morton with its garrison and temple mission. Beyond that the provincial capital Velton, and beyond that, past the mountain pass, the royal capital Eltris. 4 points in a straight line from the wastelands to the throne. Daniel looked at the map he had drawn in the dirt and didn't see geography. He saw a logistics chain, warehouse, distribution center, regional hub, central node for links. His warehouse stood at the very start of the chain, the farthest point from everything that mattered. But when the drought moved west, his point would be the first on the path of everyone fleeing it. Ariel explained the temple's ideology. The gift of the earth was not just an ability, it was a religion. The earth bears fruit only for those who are worthy. Earth mages are the chosen ones. The stronger the gift, the closer to God. Those weak in the gift are far from God. Those without it are rejected altogether. If you are starving, the earth does not want to feed you. Exile to the wastelands was framed not as punishment, but as ritual, releasing the weak into the earth's hands. The earth does not want them. No one returns. Daniel listened with his face unchanged, but inside something tightened. He knew systems like this in his world. They were less overt, but functionally identical. If you work in a warehouse for minimum wage and fall asleep at the wheel after a 12-hour shift, that is your problem. You should have tried harder. Ariel had left the temple because it refused to feed starving villagers on the eastern border. 3 villages that had lost their harvest, an early sign of the drought. The priests consulted and refused. The land was testing these people, and if they were worthy, the harvest would return. Ariel had stood behind a column and listened, and at that moment something inside her broke. Not right away, slowly, like a crack in a wall that widens until the wall falls. She left at night without permission, without a blessing, a crime, punishable by exile. The irony, she left to help exiles and became one. She put her knowledge to work immediately, writing a long list on smooth stone with charcoal in neat temple-educated handwriting. Building materials, iron for tools, a loom, a potter's wheel, maps of aquifers, political allies, and underlined protection from the temple when it found out. When, not if, merchants would spread the rumor would reach Carvin to Morden to the temple's representative office, from there to High Priest Colden, and then it would begin. 3 months at most before the temple came for them. Daniel mentally rearranged his plan. Walls had become more urgent than garden beds, people more important than sheep. He needed fighters, not for war, but to make the cost of attacking the camp higher than the cost of leaving it alone. That's how the logistics of conflict work. If attacking costs more than leaving well enough alone, no one attacks. He explained this to Ariel. She listened with the expression he was beginning to recognize, a mixture of surprise and respect, and said, "You think like a general." He shook his head. "No, I think like a quartermaster. A general counts soldiers. A quartermaster counts the days until the enemy's supplies run out." She looked at him for a long time, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not admiration, but genuine intellectual interest. One mind regarding another as an equal. Construction accelerated with the new tools from the merchants. Pickaxes bit into stone, shovels dug, hammers drove nails. By the 60th day the wall was complete, 1.5 meters high. A full perimeter with a gate made from 2 large stones set upright. Not a fortress, a fence. But something changed in the people the moment the wall was closed. Daniel saw it in their gait, in their voices. They stopped looking over their shoulders, stopped flinching at every sound. The wall told them a simple thing. Here inside, out there. It is safe here. The old man with the cane ran his hand along the stone and said, "I had a wall like this around my house once. Then they took the house and the wall. Now there is a wall again." Daniel stood nearby and said nothing. On the 65th day, a small quick-eyed woman arrived from Carvin claiming she had lost her way. She said her name was Yona. She was a traveler. She needed water and shelter. Daniel gave her both and seated her at the communal table with a bowl of hot food. And he watched her eat while her eyes moved, counting people, assessing walls, searching for the source of the food. He had seen this before. Inspectors sometimes came to the warehouse disguised as customers. They behaved exactly the same way. Yona stayed 2 days. On the 3rd, she packed to leave. Daniel met her at the gate and said, "Wait, you are not lost. You came to look around. Tell me who sent you, or I will tell you everything I noticed." Her face went through 4 expressions in rapid succession: lie, run, fight, confess. She chose a 5th. She smiled and said, "My father sent me, head of the Carvin Trade Guild. He wants to know where the food comes from, and how much it would take for you to work exclusively for him." Daniel said, "Come back inside. Let's talk." They talked for 2 hours. Yona knew the prices of every commodity within a 5-city radius, the caravan routes, the names of every major merchant and their weaknesses. She could calculate in her head faster than Daniel could on paper. He didn't offer her a deal with her father. He offered her a job, managing the camp's trade flows. She laughed. "You're asking me to abandon the guild for a job in a desert camp with 40 people?" He replied, "No, I'm offering you something your father will never give you. A place where you're valued for who you are, not for your last name." She stopped laughing. She said, "I'll think about it," and she left. A week later she returned with 3 carts of tools, a trade agreement letter from her father, and a small leather trunk containing her personal belongings. She placed the trunk against the wall, looked at Daniel, and said, "I've thought about it." With Yona's arrival, the camp ceased to be a camp. She devised a system that didn't exist in Altera: fixed prices. In this world, every transaction was a haggle. Buyer and seller argued until they were hoarse. Yona said, "One price for everyone, always. Take it or leave it." At first, the merchants were outraged. Then they grew accustomed. Then they appreciated it, because fixed prices meant predictability, predictability meant trust, and trust meant money. When he explained the concept of a contract to her in broken Altera mixed with gestures, she looked at him and said, "You're from a place where people are smarter than here." He shook his head. "Not smarter. They've just been trading longer." By the 80th day, the population was 53. Artisans from villages ravaged by poor harvests, wandering laborers, single women with children, elderly couples. Everyone received a bowl, a spot by the wall, and one question: "What can you do?" A man said he could weave baskets. Daniel said, "Weave." A man said he could cut stone. Daniel said, "Cut." A woman said she could weave fabric. Daniel said, the loom will arrive in 2 weeks, help in the kitchen until then. Everyone took their place in the system, like merchandise sorted on shelves. Everyone needed, everyone in place. Ariel tracked the people, name, origin, skills, health, special needs. First with charcoal on flat stones, then with pencils and paper Daniel ordered from the terminal's basic supplies catalog. She held a pencil up and turned it over in her hands with the expression of someone receiving a small miracle. He shrugged. It's a pencil. She looked at him like he'd handed her the world. The garden beds were growing, tomatoes 20 centimeters tall, carrot tops sprouting, basil producing its first leaves, seeds from earth taking root in the soil of Altera. Daniel expanded the plots and showed 6 people how to water, how to loosen the soil, how row spacing affects yield. Things he knew from articles he had read during night shifts out of boredom. Useless knowledge for a logistics specialist who would never be a farmer. Now every bit of it was worth lives. On the 91st day, Turan woke Daniel in the middle of the night. His voice was quiet. His face was serious. Torches on the horizon to the west, many of them moving in formation. Daniel stood on a rock and counted 10, 15, maybe 20 points of light. To organize for refugees, too many for a caravan. They were marching. About 2 hours away. He woke Ariel. She looked at the torches and went pale. Not the temple. Too early for that. Mercenaries, most likely from a merchant's guild that hadn't gotten access to the food and decided it was easier to take it than negotiate. He woke Yona. She cursed, counted the torches, cursed again. Those are Garza's men, she said. Her father's competitor, the head of the Western Trade Branch. 25 to 30 professionals, armed, and they'd been marching through the wastelands for 3 days. 3 days through the wastelands, Daniel repeated slowly. 3 days in this heat without proper water. He looked at Yona, then at Ariel, and smiled. Yona frowned. What is so funny? He replied, they haven't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. His plan was so simple that Ariel looked at him like he was insane. Yona shook her head. Turan said he would rather die with a sword. Daniel said, no, my plan, my responsibility. If it fails, run to the cliffs. The terminal door is heavy, it will hold. He spent the rest of the night at the terminal ordering, counting, preparing. Mira helped without a word, carrying food and water from the serving window to the gate. Her hands trembling slightly, but her face calm. She trusted him completely, without reservation, because in 3 months, he had never promised what he could not deliver. If he said there would be food, there was food. If he said the plan would work, it would work. At dawn, 28 mercenaries stopped 30 paces from the gate, armed, leather-armored. Faces darkened by sun and wind, eyes red from sand, lips cracked, every flask on every belt empty. Their commander looked at Daniel, a skinny and armed man in dirty clothes, and smirked. Give us the source of the magical food and you'll all live. Daniel looked at the commander, then at his men, and saw what a logistics officer sees when he looks at empty shelves. They were at their absolute limit. 3 days in the desert had wrung them out like rags, and in 6 more hours under this sun, half of them would collapse. He raised his hand, turned to the gate, nodded. Mira came out from behind the wall carrying a tray. On it, 28 clay mugs filled with cold, clean water and 28 pieces of fresh bread, soft, fragrant, the scent drifting on the wind to reach the mercenaries before they even saw the food clearly. She set the tray on the ground in front of the gate, bowed, and went back behind the wall. Daniel said, eat first, then we'll talk. The commander said, a trap. Daniel shrugged. 28 portions of bread and water? If this is a trap, it's the tastiest one of your life. Silence hung heavy. Then a young mercenary in the back rose, cracked lips bleeding, stepped forward and took a mug. He drank it in one long pull, took the bread, took a bite, closed his eyes. A second mercenary stepped forward, a third, a fourth. One by one they approached the tray. The commander was the last to stand. His face was stone. He watched as his elite men sat down on the ground and ate bread from the hand of their enemy. Then he walked to the tray, took the final mug, the final piece of bread, and ate slowly, deliberately, eyes watching Daniel over the rim. When the bowl was empty, he asked, why? Daniel replied, because a hungry man makes bad decisions. A full man makes the right ones. Eat, think, then decide. By noon, 14 of the 28 had chosen to stay. The commander left with the rest, silently, without threats, without promises. And his 14 former men sat inside the walls eating hot soup. Among them was a woman named Caravan, tall, with a scar across her eyebrow and a limp in her left leg, who sat apart and ate in silence, and when Daniel asked what she could do, looked at her large scarred hands and said it plainly, kill. He said, you don't need to kill here, but you do need to defend. There is a difference. She thought about it, then nodded. Within 2 weeks, Kyra had the camp security organized, to guards at the gate, to on the cliff, 4-hour shifts, night watches, morning patrols, all done in silence, methodically, by someone who had understood the value of vigilance her entire life. Daniel offered her the role of head of security. She looked at the wall, at the children by the hearth, at the old man carving a spoon, at Mira carrying water, and then she said one word, yes. On the 100th day, Daniel stood at the terminal and looked at the screen. 68% power, 119 rations, 6 to 7 people. Consumption stable. The first harvest of white root had yielded 20 kilograms. The sheep were thriving, 7 head, 1 pregnant. Trade was running steadily through 3 caravans per month. The wall stood, security was in place, Ariel managed accounting and diplomacy. Mira ran the warehouse alongside him. Kyra defended the perimeter. Turan led construction. Yona managed trade. Everyone in their place. The system worked. But the cracked 7th panel couldn't be repaired, which meant 68% was the ceiling. 119 rations was the maximum, and if the population exceeded 60, 3 meals a day would become impossible. He found the answer in a section of the terminal catalog he had overlooked until now. Agricultural additives, fertilizers, concentrated nutrient mixtures for soil. He sat and calculated for 2 hours. If instead of some ready-made portions, he ordered fertilizers and seeds and planted them, then in 2 months the fields would yield enough that he could cut back on terminal food orders, freeing capacity for more fertilizers, which would feed the next harvest. A closed loop, spiraling upward. He started immediately, clearing a new plot, 10 meters by 10, applying fertilizer according to the Korean instructions Ariel carefully transcribed. At planting rice, earth rice in Altera soil, with fertilizer from another world. On the 110th day, a healer named Lena Morgan arrived, not an outcast, a wandering herbalist who had heard that a man in the wastelands was treating dehydration without magic and came to see for herself. He showed her an empty rehydration packet and explained, salt, sugar, potassium, water in the right proportions. She tasted the residue, thought, and said, salt and sweetness together. That goes against everything I was taught, but it works. I saw the girl you saved. She would have died in my hands. I would not have had this powder. He led her to the terminal and translated the medicine catalog entry by entry, antibiotics, fever reducers, painkillers, antiseptics, vitamins. This kills the tiny enemies in the blood you cannot see. This brings down fever. This stops pain. Lena asked precise, intelligent questions. Dosage for a child, frequency, what to do when it fails, and he realized she had been thinking like a doctor all along, just without any tools. Together they built a system. He provides the medicine. She determines who needs what and explains it to patients as a new herb from the East, very strong. Swallow without chewing. People believed her. She was a familiar face. The treatment worked. That was all that mattered. On the 120th day, Lena saved a 5-year-old boy, 3 days of high fever. Childhood fever that killed 1 in 3 in Altera. A sentence Lena had watched be carried out dozens of times. 1 spoonful of children's fever syrup from the terminal, sweet, fruit-flavored. An hour later, the fever broke. 6 hours later, the boy asked for food. Lena stood at the exit of the shelter, shoulders rigid, hands clenched, holding herself together with the last of her strength. Daniel stood beside her silently. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood there. A minute later she said quietly, without turning, 10 years. For 10 years I watched them die, and every time I thought next time I would find the right herb, the right root, I never found it. He said, you had the hands, you didn't have the tools. It's not your fault. She turned to him with red eyes and asked, how can I thank you for this? He shook his head. Don't, just heal. She nodded, turned back toward the patients, and walked with her spine straight, like someone who has finally found what they are living for. By the 131st day, Salt Spring was no longer a camp. 78 people, reinforced walls to meters high, 3 gates. A well 8 meters deep dug by Turan and 10 men over 3 weeks that struck salty, but usable. Water for irrigation and household use. Daniel built a filtration system from sand and charcoal layers, simple, imperfect, good enough. Every optimization freed a resource, and every resource was immediately put to use. The rice was growing. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and touched the stalk, strong, healthy, earth rice in all terra soil, watered by a well dug by exiles, fed by fertilizer from the future. His first crop independent of the terminal. He stood and looked at the settlement, walls, shelters, hearths, a well, fields, people. The system he had built stone by stone, decision by decision, day by day. It worked. For now, it worked. But Ariel had said 6 months, and for had passed, which meant the drought and everything it carried was no longer on the horizon. It was here. The temperature spiked on the 200th day. The air turned so dry the skin cracked within hours. The wind from the east carried white dust, salt. The drought consuming the earth and spitting out salt. The same salt that had been on the plain where Daniel woke up. The well level dropped by a meter. The tomatoes yellowed. The basil dried in 2 days. He put the settlement on strict rationing. 2 liters of drinking water from the terminal per person per day. 1 liter from the well for household use. Watering the fields only at dawn and dusk when evaporation was minimal. Not a drop wasted, not even for him. Mira enforced it without a word. And when he once reached for an extra mug to wash his face after working on the wall, one silent look from her made him put it back. He had set rules for everyone. He followed them himself. People kept coming. On the 205th day, there were 120 of them. On the 210th, 140. Not in ones and twos, but in groups of 20 and 30. Entire villages approving themselves and walking east toward the rumor, toward hope, toward the place where they feed people. The math was getting tight. He couldn't close the gate. He had known that since the moment he saw the first bowl Mira placed before the dying girl. He was not the kind who closes gates, but he was a logistician, and a logistician knows that resources are finite. He found a solution between yes and no. Every new person gets 3 days of full rations, rest, water, medical care. After 3 days, a choice, stay and work, or take a week's food and move on west toward cities still standing. Many stayed, some left with full bags and stories of a place in the wastelands where strangers fed. Strangers simply because they could. On the 220th day, the temple's campaign was postponed. Calden couldn't assemble a supply train. No provisions, merchants refusing to deliver. Roads clogged with refugees, half the volunteers gone home to feed their own families. Sammy brought the news with a wide wolfish grin. Daniel nodded without celebration. Postponed didn't mean canceled. Every day without the expedition was a day the salt spring grew stronger. Another pot of fermented root ripening. Another row of rice filling with grain. Another person back on their feet after 3 days of rest and food, picking up a shovel. The pieces had moved according to plan. The 3 weeks of delay gained by Ariel's anonymous letters to Priestess Alora. Yona's father holding back the fabric shipment. Sammy's reconnaissance. All of it had shifted the timeline just enough. On the 230th day, Sandy arrived with a young priest named Theo, whom she had found unconscious by the road from Morden. Burn marks on his hands from a ritual punishment. Exiled for refusing to join the campaign against Salt Spring. He became one more form or something who found a place where what mattered was not what you had been, but what you were willing to be now. Theo brought intelligence. Calden had changed his plan, abandoning the large army in favor of 20 elite warrior priests with earth magic, moving fast across the wastelands to find and destroy the terminal, the source. Kill the source, and the settlement would die on its own. 20 earth mages with the power to crumble stone, 7 days away. Daniel closed his eyes, opened them, and gathered his council. He told them, "We will not fight." He explained, 7 days across the wastelands at current drought temperatures, with a water supply calculated for normal conditions, means by day 5 they start conserving. By day 6 they suffer. By day 7 they arrive at our gates dehydrated and barely standing. The same situation as the mercenaries, different scale. Kyra said, "Just like the mercenaries." He nodded. Ariel said quietly, "It's not madness. It's the only plan that can work. If we fight, we lose. If we feed them, we force them to choose. Kill the people who saved your life or leave. For a priest, that is not just a choice. It is a matter of faith." 2 days later, 20 figures in once white robes arrived at the gate, staggering, leaning on staffs, their earth magic useless in dead desert soil. And Daniel stood outside the wall with Ariel, alone and unarmed, while Mira and Turan carried out trays of hot noodles and chicken broth, whose steam drifted across the desert before the priests could even see the bowls clearly. Of the 20, 14 remained. The commander left with 6, silently taking the food and water Daniel gave them for the return journey. The 6 who walked back into the yellow haze would tell Colin everything: the walls, the hundreds of people, the food. But the part that would matter most was the part that couldn't be used as a weapon. That the heretics had fed those who came to destroy them. An invisible logistics specialist from Seoul, buried under someone else's name in someone else's bones at the edge of a dying world, had done the one thing the tag on his chest said he was not worth, and kept on doing it, every morning, one bowl at a time, until a stone fence became a city and a city became a proof that the weak, given only a fair chance and a hot meal, are worth everything.